Sir, you're going to have to leave. The words didn't just cut through the air, they froze it. 1 second. The restaurant was filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the low glow of amber lights reflecting off polished wood tables. The next, every sound seemed to pull back, like the room itself was holding its breath. Imagine sitting there, halfway through a quiet dinner, your plate still warm, your drink untouched, when suddenly every eye in the room shifts toward you. Not with curiosity, but with judgment. Marcus Reed didn't move right away. He sat still, shoulders relaxed, hands resting calmly on the edge of the table, as if the moment hadn't quite reached him yet. Across from him, a half-finished glass of iced tea caught the light, condensation slowly tracing down the side. He had been there less than 20 minutes. No raised voice. No disruption. Just a man sitting alone in a place where people like him were often noticed for the wrong reasons. The manager, Ethan Cole, stood just a few feet away now, his posture stiff, his expression tight with something that wasn't quite authority, but wanted to be. Behind him, 2 uniformed officers had already stepped inside, their presence shifting the energy of the room from quiet discomfort to something heavier. People turned in their chairs. Forks paused midair. Conversations faded into whispers. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes steady, not defiant, not afraid, just aware. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice even, controlled. But Ethan didn't answer the question. Instead, he glanced toward the officers, as if needing their presence to validate what he was about to do. "We've had a complaint," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. A complaint. The word lingered, vague and heavy, filling in its own meaning depending on who was listening. A woman near the window leaned closer to her companion, whispering something under her breath. A man in a navy blazer shook his head slightly, already convinced of a story he hadn't heard. Marcus felt it. Not just the eyes, but the weight behind them. The assumptions. The quiet conclusions being drawn in real time. Still, he didn't react, didn't raise his voice, didn't push back. He simply reached for his wallet, slow, deliberate, placing it on the table in front of him. "You can check whatever you need to check," he said. One of the officers, Ryan Blake, stepped forward, his hand resting lightly near his belt, not aggressive, but not neutral either. "Sir, we're going to need you to stand up." There it was. The shift. The moment where a dinner became a scene, where a man became a problem. Chairs creaked as people leaned back to watch. Someone pulled out a phone, subtle but not invisible. The room, once warm and inviting, now felt colder, sharper, like every light had turned into a spotlight. Marcus glanced around, not in panic, not in confusion, but in quiet recognition of what this moment had become. He exhaled slowly, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the floor. As he stood, something small slipped from the edge of his jacket pocket, hitting the ground with a faint metallic sound that barely registered beneath the tension. No one noticed. Not yet. But Marcus did. And for the first time, something shifted, not in his posture, not in his expression, but somewhere deeper, quieter. "You might want to rethink this," he said softly. Not a threat, not a warning, just a truth waiting for its moment. The metallic sound was soft, almost invisible beneath the tension, but it lingered just long enough to matter. Officer Ryan Blake glanced down instinctively, his eyes catching the small object resting against the polished floor. For a brief second, the room seemed to narrow around that single point. He bent slightly, reaching down with measured caution, and picked it up between his fingers. It was heavier than it looked. A coin, but not the kind you find in loose change. Its surface was worn, edges marked by time, engraved with an eagle and a set of numbers that were not random. Ryan turned it over once, his expression tightening, something unspoken flickering across his face before he masked it again. "Stand up, sir," he repeated, though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. Marcus was already standing, calm, still, watching, not the officers, not the manager, but the space between them, as if he had seen this moment before in a different place, under very different circumstances. Ethan shifted his weight, clearing his throat, trying to reclaim control of a situation that no longer felt entirely his. "We just need you to cooperate," he said, forcing a polite tone that did not quite reach his eyes. Cooperate. Another word that carried more meaning than it said. Around them, The audience grew quieter. A woman near the bar slowly lowered her glass, her attention fully captured now. A couple near the entrance exchanged a glance, uncertain whether they were witnessing something routine or something they would later question. Marcus placed his hands loosely at his sides, not raised, not defensive, just present. "I have been cooperating," he said. His voice remained steady, almost measured, like someone used to choosing words carefully because they mattered. Ryan looked at the coin again, then back at Marcus. "Where did you get this?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Ethan frowned, clearly not understanding the shift. "What does that have to do with anything?" he interjected quickly, his impatience rising. But Ryan did not answer him. His focus stayed on Marcus, searching for something deeper than the surface of the situation. Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "It was given to me," he replied. Simple, direct, but the way he said it carried weight. Not pride, not arrogance, just fact. The kind of fact that did not need explanation to be true. A faint murmur moved through the room. Someone whispered, trying to piece together what they were seeing. The story they thought they understood was beginning to crack, but not enough to fully break. Not yet. Ethan stepped forward again, his voice sharper now. "This is not relevant. The issue is that we received a report, and we have the right to ask him to leave." The word right hung in the air, heavy with assumption. Ryan hesitated, just for a second. But in moments like this, a second was enough. Marcus noticed. Of course he did. He had been noticing everything from the moment the first stare lingered too long. "Officer," Marcus said quietly, his tone unchanged. "You already know what that is." Ryan's jaw tightened. He did know. Or at least, he suspected. And that suspicion was enough to unsettle the clean narrative that had been forming just minutes ago. The room felt different now. Not calmer, not safer, just uncertain. Like something beneath the surface was beginning to shift, and no one could quite see where it would lead. Marcus did not move, did not rush, did not explain. He simply waited. Because sometimes, the truth does not need to be forced into the light. Sometimes, it only needs a moment for someone to recognize it. Ryan Blake did not answer right away. His fingers tightened slightly around the coin, his thumb brushing over the engraved surface as if trying to confirm what his mind was already telling him. The noise of the restaurant began to return in fragments, a glass setting down too hard, a chair shifting, a quiet breath released somewhere in the room, but none of it broke the tension that had settled between him and Marcus. Ethan exhaled sharply, stepping closer, his patience thinning with every passing second. "Officer, this is getting unnecessary," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "We called you here to handle a situation, not to analyze pocket change." But Ryan did not look at him. Not yet. His eyes stayed on Marcus, searching, recalculating. The man standing in front of him did not fit the picture that had been handed to him when he walked through the door. Not the posture, not the stillness, not the way he spoke without urgency, as if he knew something no one else in the room had caught up to yet. "Sir," Ryan said finally, his tone quieter now, more measured, "I am going to ask again. Where did you get this?" Marcus glanced briefly at the coin, then back at Ryan. "It was given to me after my second deployment," he said. No hesitation, no embellishment, just a sentence that landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Deployment. The word moved through Ryan like a shift in gravity. It reframed everything. The stance, the calm, the warning that had not sounded like a warning. Across the room, someone whispered the word under their breath, as if repeating it might make it clearer. Ethan blinked, confusion crossing his face. "Deployment," he echoed, but the words sounded out of place coming from him, like he was reading a script he did not understand. Ryan straightened slightly, the coin still in his hand. "You served?" he asked, the question softer now, less like an interrogation and more like confirmation. Marcus gave a small nod. "Yes." One word, but it carried years behind it. The kind of years that do not need to be listed to be felt. Ryan swallowed, his gaze shifting again to the coin, then back to Marcus. Something in his posture changed, subtle but undeniable. The edge was gone, replaced by something closer to respect, or at least the beginning of it. Ethan noticed. Of course he did, and it unsettled him. "Okay, and what does that have to do with anything happening right now?" He pressed, his voice rising slightly, trying to pull the moment back into something he could control. "We are not questioning his background. We are dealing with a complaint. Complaint. The word felt weaker now, less certain. Ryan took a slow breath. The room was watching him now, not just Marcus, waiting to see which direction he would go. The easy path was still there. Follow procedure. Remove the man. Close the call. But the coin in his hand made that path feel different. He looked at Marcus again, really looked this time. The steady eyes. The controlled breathing. The absence of fear where fear would normally be. What was your unit? Ryan asked quietly. Marcus held his gaze. United States Marine Corps, he said. A pause. Then, just enough to shift everything. Infantry. The word landed like a quiet echo, spreading through the room in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Ethan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as if something inside him recognized that the story he had believed at the start of this night was no longer holding together. Ryan nodded slowly, almost to himself, the pieces aligning whether he wanted them to or not. And suddenly, the question was no longer just about why Marcus was being asked to leave. It was about why he had been asked in the first place. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like the air itself had shifted and no one quite knew how to breathe the same way again. Ryan Blake lowered his hand slightly, still holding the coin, but no longer gripping it like evidence. Now it felt more like something else entirely. Something that did not belong in this moment of accusation. Something that did not match the version of the story that had been building just minutes ago. Ethan let out a short, controlled laugh, the kind people use when they are trying to dismiss something they do not understand. Look, I do not care if he served or not, he said, his voice tightening as he spoke. That does not change the fact that we had a report. My staff felt uncomfortable. We have rules here. Rules. The word landed, but it did not carry the same authority it had before. Not after everything that had just been said. Not after the shift that everyone in the room could feel, even if they could not explain it. Marcus did not respond right away. He simply looked at Ethan, not with anger, not with challenge, but with something quieter, something steadier. The kind of look that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. Uncomfortable, Marcus repeated softly. Not mocking, not accusing, just acknowledging the word as it was. Around them, the room had changed. The earlier whispers were gone, replaced by a different kind of silence. Not judgment, not curiosity, something closer to awareness. A man near the bar straightened in his seat, his expression no longer certain. A woman who had been watching from across the room slowly folded her arms, her gaze shifting between Ethan and Marcus as if reevaluating everything she thought she had seen. Ryan glanced toward Ethan now, finally breaking his focus. What exactly was the complaint? He asked, his tone careful, deliberate. Ethan hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. A customer reported that he was acting suspicious, he said, choosing his words quickly, as if speed could replace clarity. Ryan's brow furrowed slightly. Suspicious how? The question hung there, simple and direct, but suddenly difficult to answer. Ethan opened his mouth, then paused. The room was listening again, not the way they had been before, waiting for confirmation of a story they had already accepted, but now waiting for something else. Something real. He was just sitting there. Ethan said finally, the words sounding weaker the moment they left his mouth. Watching people. Not ordering much. It did not seem right. Not right. Another phrase that relied on feeling more than fact. Ryan looked back at Marcus, then at the table behind him. The glass of iced tea. The plate. The bill folder resting neatly near the edge. Nothing out of place. Nothing that suggested anything beyond what it was. A man having a quiet meal. Ryan exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling in a different way now. Sir, he said, turning fully toward Marcus, his tone no longer edged with authority but grounded in something steadier. Have you done anything tonight that would explain why someone might feel concerned? Marcus shook his head once. No, simple, clear, the kind of answer that did not try to convince. It just existed. Ryan nodded slightly, as if that confirmed what he already knew. The pieces did not fit the way they were supposed to. And when things do not fit, you either force them, or you step back and ask why. Ethan shifted again, his confidence slipping in ways he could not fully control. So what? We are just ignoring a complaint now, he said, his voice rising, but it no longer carried the same weight. Ryan did not look at him immediately. When he finally did, his expression had changed. Not confrontational, not aggressive, just firm in a way that did not need volume. "No," Ryan said quietly. "We are making sure the complaint makes sense." And in that moment, for the first time since the night began, the balance of the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that everyone could feel it. Because the story was no longer about removing a man. It was about understanding why he had been singled out in the first place. The shift did not happen all at once. It moved slowly, like a current changing direction beneath still water, subtle but undeniable if you were paying attention. Ryan Blake stood there for a moment longer, the coin still resting in his palm, his mind working through everything that no longer lined up. Across from him, Marcus Reed remained exactly as he had been from the start, steady, composed, present in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. Ethan Cole, on the other hand, was beginning to feel it slip. Not the control he thought he had, but the certainty behind it. The kind of certainty that had felt solid just minutes ago now seemed thinner, like it had been built on something he had never questioned until now. "So what are you saying?" Ethan asked, his voice sharper now, but there was something underneath it. Not authority, not confidence, something closer to defensiveness. Ryan did not answer immediately. He glanced around the room, taking in the faces that were no longer aligned the way they had been before. The quiet agreement that had once filled the space had fractured. People were no longer watching Marcus as the problem. They were watching the situation itself. "I am saying," Ryan began slowly, choosing each word with care, "that asking someone to leave requires a reason that can be explained, not just felt." The sentence settled into the room, simple but heavy. Ethan shook his head quickly. "This is private property. We have the right to refuse service." The words came out faster now, as if speed could rebuild the authority that was slipping through his fingers. Ryan nodded slightly. "That is true," he said. "But there is a difference between a policy and a pattern." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the phrasing. "What is that supposed to mean?" Ryan looked at Marcus again, then back at Ethan. "It means we need to be clear about why this happened tonight. Not just for him, for everyone here." The room seemed to lean in again, but this time not out of curiosity, out of recognition, because somewhere in that statement was something larger than the moment itself. Marcus remained silent, but his presence carried more weight now than any words could have. He did not interrupt, did not defend, did not explain. He simply allowed the moment to unfold, as if he understood that sometimes the truth reveals itself more clearly when it is not forced. Near the back of the room, a man who had been quietly observing stepped forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I have been here the whole time," he said, his voice calm but firm. He did not do anything wrong. The statement was not loud, but it carried. A second voice followed, a woman near the window. "I saw the same thing," she added. "He was just sitting there." The shift deepened. What had started as a single complaint was now being weighed against multiple perspectives. Not assumptions, not impressions, observations. Ethan looked around, his eyes moving from one face to another, searching for the support that had once been there so easily. But it was different now. The room was no longer backing the version of events he had presented. It was questioning it. Ryan let out a slow breath, the final pieces settling into place. He stepped slightly closer to Marcus, his tone respectful, grounded. "Sir," he said, "based on what I am seeing, there is no clear reason for you to be asked to leave." The words landed quietly, but their impact was immediate. A line had been drawn. Not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly. Ethan opened his mouth, ready to push back, but nothing came out right away. Because for the first time since the night began, he was not the one defining the situation. The narrative had shifted, and it was no longer under his control. Marcus gave a small nod, not in triumph, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. As if this outcome was not surprising to him. As if he had known, from the very beginning, that the truth would eventually find its place in the room. For a moment, no one moved. The words Ryan had just spoken did not echo, but they settled, firm and final, into every corner of the room. Marcus Reed remained standing beside the table, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if this outcome had never been in question for him. Not because he expected special treatment, but because he understood something most people in that room were only beginning to realize. Ethan Cole stood frozen, his mind racing to recover ground that no longer existed beneath him. The room that once leaned in his direction now felt distant, detached, as if it had quietly stepped away from him, without saying a word. "So that is it," Ethan said finally, his voice lower now, less sharp, but edged with something else. Frustration, maybe, or the slow recognition that the situation had shifted beyond his control. Ryan turned toward him, his tone steady. "That is it," he said. "Unless there is something specific you can point to that justifies removing him." The question was not aggressive. It did not need to be. It was direct, grounded, and impossible to answer without exposing the weakness behind the original claim. Ethan hesitated again, longer this time. His eyes moved across the room, searching for support, for agreement, for anything that might reinforce what he had started. But the faces looking back at him were different now. Not hostile, not confrontational, just aware. Aware enough to see that what had felt justified moments ago now looked something else entirely. Marcus slowly reached for his chair and pulled it back into place, the soft sound of wood against the floor breaking the tension just enough to remind everyone that this was still a normal space. Or at least, it was trying to be again. He did not rush, did not make a scene. He simply sat back down, as if reclaiming something that had never truly been taken, just interrupted. Ryan watched him for a second, then extended his hand slightly, offering the coin back. "Sir," he said, "this belongs to you." Marcus accepted it with a small nod, his fingers closing around it with a familiarity that suggested it had been held many times before, in places far removed from the quiet tension of a restaurant dining room. "Thank you," Marcus replied. 2 words. Calm, controlled, complete. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck, the tension in his shoulders now visible. "Look," he began, his voice shifting again, searching for a new angle. "If there was a misunderstanding, we can resolve it. But my staff..." He stopped himself mid-sentence, as if realizing that continuing down that path would only expose more than he intended. Ryan did not interrupt. He simply waited, because sometimes silence reveals more than pressure ever could. Across the room, a server who had been standing near the kitchen doorway stepped forward slightly, her voice hesitant but clear. "He ordered, paid, and was just sitting quietly," she said. There was no issue until someone pointed him out. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Not accusation, not emotion, just clarity. And clarity, in moments like this, is often the most powerful thing in the room. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the realization settling in deeper now. This was no longer about managing a situation. It was about explaining one. And that is a much harder position to stand in. Marcus sat there, still composed, still silent, his presence no longer questioned but understood in a way that did not need explanation. Ryan stepped back slightly, creating space where there had once been tension. The room began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, as conversations tried to return, though not quite the same as before. Because something had changed, not just in what had happened, but in how it had been seen. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Marcus lifted his glass of iced tea, taking a quiet sip, as if closing a moment that had never required his voice to begin with. Because sometimes, dignity does not come from what you say. It comes from what you refuse to become, even when everything around you tries to define you otherwise. The restaurant did not return to normal right away. It tried, in small ways, in quiet gestures. But something lingered in the air that could not simply be cleared with background music and polite conversation. It was the kind of silence that comes after something has been revealed, not loudly, but clearly enough that it changes how people see everything that came before it. Marcus Reed sat at his table, composed as ever, his movements unhurried, his presence steady in a way that no longer invited suspicion but commanded quiet respect. The glass in his hand caught the light again as he set it down, the condensation forming a small ring on the table, a simple detail that now felt grounding, almost symbolic. Across the room, Ethan Cole stood near the edge of the dining area, no longer at the center of anything. His posture had softened, the sharp edges of his earlier confidence worn down by the weight of what had unfolded. He adjusted his tie slightly, then let his hand fall, as if realizing there was nothing left to fix in that moment. Officer Ryan Blake remained nearby, not as an enforcer of a situation, but as a witness to its resolution. His stance had changed too, less rigid, more reflective, as if he was still processing the quiet shift that had taken place. "Sir," Ryan said after a moment, stepping closer to Marcus again, his voice respectful, measured. "I want to apologize for how this was handled." The words were simple, but they carried something real behind them. Not obligation, not procedure, recognition. Marcus looked up at him, his expression unchanged, calm as ever. He studied Ryan for a brief second, not judging, not dismissing, just acknowledging the moment for what it was. "I understand," Marcus replied. No bitterness, no edge, just acceptance, but not the kind that excuses what happened, the kind that moves past it without letting it define him. Ryan nodded once, as if that response meant more than any reaction would have. He stepped back slightly, giving Marcus space, but not distance. The difference mattered. Near the entrance, a couple who had been watching the entire situation quietly gathered their things, their earlier expressions replaced with something more thoughtful. One of them glanced back at Marcus as they passed, offering a small nod, not out of pity, but respect. It was subtle, but it was there, and it was different from the looks that had filled the room before. Ethan finally moved, walking slowly toward Marcus's table. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the distance, but because of what it represented. He stopped a few feet away, hesitating, searching for words that would not come easily. "Sir," Ethan began, his voice lower now, stripped of the authority it once tried to project. I owe you an apology." The sentence came out uneven, not rehearsed, not polished, but real in a way that forced him to face it as he said it. Marcus looked at him, his gaze steady, giving him the space to finish. "This should not have happened," Ethan continued, the words slower. Now, more deliberate. "You were not treated fairly." There it was. Not an excuse, not a justification, a statement. Marcus held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. "No," he said quietly, "it should not have." The agreement did not carry anger. It carried truth. And sometimes, truth is the most difficult thing to stand in front of. Ethan swallowed, the weight of that acknowledgement settling deeper than anything else could have. Around them, the room had shifted again. Not back to what it was before, but into something new, something more aware. Because the moment was not just about what had happened to one man. It was about what everyone else had seen and what they would carry with them after they left. Marcus reached for the bill folder, opening it calmly, as if closing a chapter that had never required chaos to begin with. Because in the end, the loudest moments are not always the ones that leave the deepest mark. Sometimes it is the quiet ones, the ones where nothing explodes, nothing breaks, but everything changes. Marcus Reed closed the bill folder slowly, sliding a few crisp bills inside before placing it neatly at the edge of the table. The gesture was simple, routine even, but in that moment it carried a quiet finality. Not just the end of a meal, but the closing of something deeper, something that had unfolded without his permission, yet had revealed more than anyone in the room expected. He stood up, adjusting his jacket with the same calm precision he had carried from the beginning. No rush. No lingering hesitation, just movement forward. Around him, the restaurant had resumed its rhythm, but not completely. Conversations were softer now, more measured, as if people were aware that what they had witnessed was not something that could be easily dismissed or forgotten. A server stepped forward, her expression respectful, her tone gentle. "Sir, your meal has been taken care of," she said quietly. Marcus paused, looking at her for a moment, reading not just the words, but the intention behind them. It was not pity. It was acknowledgement. Still, he shook his head slightly. "I will pay for my meal," he replied. His voice was calm, but firm in a way that left no room for negotiation. Because dignity is not something you accept as compensation. It is something you carry, regardless of how others try to define you. The server nodded, understanding, stepping back without argument. Ethan remained nearby, watching, his earlier confidence replaced by a kind of quiet reflection that had not been there before. He seemed smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence, as if the role he had stepped into earlier no longer fit him the same way. "Thank you for staying," Ethan said, almost instinctively, though the words felt misplaced the moment they left his mouth. Marcus met his gaze briefly, not unkind, not dismissive, but clear. "I did not stay," Marcus said. "I was already here." The distinction was subtle, but it landed. because the moment had never been about entering or leaving. It had been about belonging. Officer Ryan Blake stood near the entrance now, holding the door open as a few guests quietly made their way out, their expressions thoughtful, their movements slower than before. He glanced back toward Marcus as he approached, giving a small nod that did not require words. Marcus returned it just as simply, a mutual understanding passing between them that did not need to be spoken aloud. As Marcus stepped toward the exit, the room seemed to follow him, not with eyes filled with judgment this time, but with something closer to respect. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. The kind of presence that lingers long after a moment has passed. Outside, the night air was cooler, a gentle contrast to the warmth inside. The streetlights cast long reflections across the pavement, steady and unchanging, indifferent to what had just taken place within those walls. Marcus paused for a brief second just outside the door, his hand brushing lightly against the coin in his pocket. Not to check it, not to confirm it was there, but as a quiet reminder. Not of what had happened tonight, but of everything that came long before it. He did not look back. He did not need to, because the moment had already said everything it needed to say. And as he walked down the sidewalk, steady and unbothered, the world moved with him. Unchanged on the surface, but different in the way it had been seen. Because sometimes, the most powerful shifts do not come from confrontation. They come from presence, from restraint, from the quiet refusal to become what others expect. And in that quiet, something undeniable had taken place. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been watching. The door closed softly behind Marcus Reed, the sound barely noticeable against the quiet rhythm of the city outside. Yet inside the restaurant it marked something far more permanent than his departure. For a moment, no one spoke. The space he left behind did not feel empty, it felt exposed, as if something invisible had been pulled back and could not be covered again. Ethan Cole stood where he was, his eyes lingering on the door long after it had shut, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. The weight of the evening did not leave with Marcus. It stayed. It settled into the walls, into the tables, into the quiet realization that what had happened could not be undone with a simple apology. Around him, the staff moved more carefully now, their voices softer, their glances more deliberate. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot return to the comfort of not knowing. Ryan Blake stepped outside a few seconds later, the cool air meeting him as he looked down the street. He spotted Marcus already halfway down the block, walking with the same steady pace, shoulders relaxed, as if the night had not taken anything from him. Ryan hesitated, then called out, not loudly, just enough to carry. Marcus. The name felt different now. Not just a label, but recognition. Marcus stopped, turning slightly, his expression calm, as always. Ryan approached, closing the distance between them, the city lights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. For a moment, he said nothing, as if choosing the right words mattered more than saying something quickly. I should have asked more questions when I walked in, Ryan admitted finally. His voice was quiet, but honest. Marcus studied him for a second, then gave a small nod. Most people do not, he replied. No accusation, just truth. Ryan exhaled slowly, absorbing that. That does not make it right, he said. Marcus held his gaze, then reached into his pocket, pulling out the coin for a brief moment, letting it rest in his palm under the streetlight. The metal caught the glow, revealing its worn edges, its history, its meaning. No, Marcus said, closing his hand around it again, but it makes it common. The words lingered between them, heavier than anything else that had been said that night. Ryan nodded once more, understanding settling in deeper now. Not just about what happened, but about how often it could happen again if nothing changed. Marcus slipped the coin back into his pocket, then turned slightly, ready to continue on. Take care, officer, he said, his tone respectful, but final. Ryan watched him go, the distance between them growing with each step, but the impact of the moment remaining exactly where it had landed. Back inside, Ethan finally moved, walking slowly through the dining area, seeing it differently now. The same tables, the same lights, the same polished surfaces, but none of it felt the same, because something had shifted that could not be reset. A mirror had been held up, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough that ignoring it was no longer an option. He paused near the table where Marcus had been sitting, his hand resting lightly against the chair, as if trying to understand how something so quiet could carry so much weight. And in that silence, the lesson settled in, not as punishment, but as truth. Because the night was never about removing a man from a place. It was about revealing what happens when people decide, without knowing, who belongs and who does not. And the real consequence was not what Marcus experienced. It was what everyone else had to carry after he walked away. He left with his dignity untouched. They stayed behind with the question of whether there still was